All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Stephanie Rao, Executive Director at the National Council on Public History. We are a membership association dedicated to helping public historians put history to work in the world through community building, programs, and scholarship. Thank you for joining us today for the final roundtable in our five-part series, Considering the Revolution. Before turning things over to our facilitator and series editor today, I want to introduce our conversation. Before I introduce her to start the conversation, I wanted to share a few housekeeping notes with everyone. This webinar is being recorded and a link will be sent to you probably, if not tomorrow, early next week. Closed captions have been enabled, so if you don't see them automatically, you can click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free throughout the presentation to use the chat area to let us know where you're joining us from. If you have questions for our presenters, you can put those in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So just to recap, chat, keep your comments if you want to share resources and information with each other. Just say hello, and then questions, please use the Q&A box. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our facilitator today, who also is serving as the editor of this 5-year series for the public historian. MJ Rymsza-Pawlowska is Associate Professor of History and past Director of the Graduate Program in Public History at American University, where she researches and teaches on historiography, public history theory and method, the history of museums, and local history. She is the author of History Comes Alive, Public History and Popular Culture in the 1970s from the University of North Carolina Press, and she's currently working on 2 new book projects. The first about the history of visitors and newcomers to Washington, entitled Your Nation's Capital, How Visitors Made Washington, D.C. and Vice Versa. She's also completing a shorter monograph tentatively called If Everyone's a Historian. Rymsza-Pawlowska is currently a visiting research fellow at the University of Luxembourg's Center for Contemporary and Digital History. She currently holds a US at 250 fellowship at New America and is a Smithsonian Research Associate. So thank you so much for agreeing to facilitate this conversation, for editing this amazing series of conversations we've been having over the last few years, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And yeah, I'm so excited for this conversation. So just a little bit of background before I introduced our panelists. So this is the last installment of a 5-year series. Originally, it was for the purpose of helping National Park Service and other practitioners consider new perspectives and stories for interpretation, initiatives, and programming around the 250th. I know that there are a lot of practitioners in the audience, so we all know that commemorative planning takes lots and lots of time. So we're very excited that there's the 4 years of panels and write-ups available. The University of California Press and NCPH have made that happen. That's really exciting. This is the last panel discussion, and also now that we're a year away from 2026, programming has begun, but also so many different things have happened. So we're going to be talking about all those things. So for this last installment in the series, we are switching focus. The conversation will be more about reflection and moving ahead with an emphasis on practice and on present and on the future. So all of our panelists are returning panelists. So they have they've been thinking about these issues for a long time. Questions were circulated in advance. So we'll have a conversation based on those questions. And then at the end, we will open time for audience Q&A. So before we begin, I would like to introduce our 3 panelists today. So starting with Kristen Hayashi. Kristen Hayashi is Director of Collections Management and Access and Curator at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. She's a public historian with experience ranging from being part of the curatorial team for Becoming Los Angeles, a semi-permanent exhibition at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, to being on the board of directors for the Little Tokyo Historical Society and Asian Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation. Ista Clarke is the current cultural history interpretation specialist at Charleston County Parks. He leads tours at the McLeod Plantation Historic Site and countywide, focusing on the history and treatment of the enslaved, their descendants, and African descended people in the modern area or to the modern era. He's also the former operations manager at the Old Slave Mart Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, located in the remains of the last standing slave auction hall in the state. Clarke was responsible for training interpreters, emphasizing empathy, and developing strategies for dealing with racially biased and inappropriate visitor commentary. Previously, Clarke worked as docent at the Old Exchange and Provost Dungeon in Charleston. Nicole Moore is our last panelist. Nicole is the Director of Education at the National Museum for Civil Rights and Human Rights in Atlanta and consults at Interpreting Life, sorry. A public historian with more than 15 years of museum experience, her primary focus has been around the interpretation of enslavement and at historic sites and museums. Nicole is the vice president of the National Council on Public History and serves on its board of directors of the Slave Dwelling Project and on the board of directors of the National Council on Public History, but also the board of directors of the Slave Dwelling Project and the Old North Illuminated. Her publications include chapters for interpreting slavery at museums and historic sites, interpreting the Civil War at museums and historic sites, and radical roots public history and social justice activism. That's essentially my intro to public history syllabus right there. So now that we have introduced all of our panelists, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you especially also for returning to this conversation and reflecting on what has been a, pretty tumultuous period. For all of you, this is your second time appearing on a panel in the series. We decided to do it this way, both because we were interested in reflecting on how planning has changed and progressed into action, but also, again, and I'll probably say this a million times, because the larger context of the commemoration has changed so much, particularly in the last year. Uh, National commemorations are always political, and I mean both capital P and lowercase p, and also deeply informed by both material and ideological concerns, right? So, both the core ideas that are engaged via commemoration, and particularly via this commemoration, as well as the resources that are available for those engagements, how we actually end up going at those core ideas are at present in a moment of flux. So I would like to begin this conversation by asking you all to reflect a little bit on how you're thinking about the commemoration and your approaches to practice have changed in the time since your last appearance, so since the last panel. So what's changed for you? Where were you then? Where are you now? Are there things that have stayed the same? So I'm interested in hearing all of your thoughts on this, and we'll go through for each of these questions, we'll go through the panel. We'll go through each person on the panel in order, and we'll try a different order each time. So I will start. I will start with Nicole.
Thank you so much, MJ. So glad to be here. So, when I think about where I was in the beginning of this process, my day to day, I'm not at a site that is looking at like revolution history and the 250th, but we do understand the impact of those legacies. And it was kind of exciting because I knew, okay, we might be able to dip and dabble and talk about where we're going, really looking forward and inviting those narratives that hadn't been told with the bicentennial, that hadn't been told originally into the conversation. Now, you know, it's interesting. It's a little rocky. The past 8 months have really changed what that looks like, what that conversation looks like, and what honestly would be allowed. I felt like we would be able to really dive into commemorating those men, women, and children whose voices hadn't been heard, who hadn't been talked about, and really seeing what their legacy and shaping who we are and shaping where we could go would be. But that headspace has changed a lot. And now I have to ask myself, do we, and for me, the answer is going to be yes, but do we really belong in this narrative? And how do we belong in this narrative? And so I'm looking at not so much dwelling on the past, but really in this moment thinking about we're 250 out from this first revolution. We have lived numerous revolutions with other historic events, and here we are really in another revolution. What have we learned? in the 250 years? What have we learned in the last 8 months that we can use going forward? How do we get past? I was like, I had high hopes. I was like, we are not going to do tricorn hats. We are not going to do fife and drum. We have moved on. We have elevated. And I feel like because of the current climate, that's almost the safe place to be because it's the accepted place to be. But I still want to challenge that. And I still want to think about um, our independence, what that looked like for other people, and what that feels like right now. I want to look at still the contributions of African Americans and those of African descent in our nation's history whose stories are actively being erased. I want to go back and remember them. I want us to remember that we have built a country on stolen lands. And how do we judge who belongs here? How do we decide who leaves and who stays or who's allowed to come in as of last night? Right? And I want to think that we have the opportunity to still have those conversations, but it's got to be with more nuance. And we end up having to, for various reasons, tiptoe, not because we don't want to talk about it, but we have to be strategic in how we're talking about commemorating 250 years of what it means to be the United States, what it means to be America, what it means to be American. We have to look at the great experiment. How's that panning out for us? And that changed significantly from the conversation started years ago, where it was like, we are about to be lit. We're going to be talking about the future, the next wave. And now I'm thinking about how do we, if we want to, hold on to what we have built so far? And how do we include those voices that we planned to bring to the forefront and continue to nurture and introduce to the generation that is out here on Beyonce's internet saying that Harriet Tubman was a fictional character? Um, and how do we make sure that those voices aren't lost? So that's kind of where I'm at in this headspace. Our practice has to be radical in a sense, but it also has to be really creative and innovative. So how do we press through? Questions I'm still pondering. Do I feel different? Not really. I had a little hope that we would move forward, but in the back of my mind, that pessimism was there that I don't know if we were really ready to. And right now, it's looking like we weren't ready to have that actual conversation that needed to be had.
Thank you so much. Kristen, we'll go to you next.
Okay, great. I'm glad you went first, Nicole. That was a really great framing and way to kick us off. So Nicole and I were part of the 2024 opening plenary for NCPH, and the theme was considering the revolution, citizenship, and sovereignty. And so for the plenary, I was asked to think about themes of citizenship and belonging and patriotism through the lens of the Japanese American experience. And so today, I think in my remarks, I'll talk specifically about the work that my colleagues and I have been doing at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. And I'll just give you a sense of what JANM looks like here. So I'm going to use the acronym JANM, which stands for Japanese American National Museum. And our mission is to promote understanding and appreciation for America's ethnic and cultural diversity by telling the Japanese American experience. We really believe that the strength of the US is its diversity, and the approaches to our practice really haven't changed since the museum was founded in 1985. And it really, starts with our leadership to determine just how we do our work, and so our leadership has really been steadfast in our principles and what we stand for. But I think really, especially lately, has been vocal to assert what we believe in. And so recently, in context of like the termination of federal funding, our leadership has underscored who we are And so we've been in the media quite a bit for taking the stance that we are DEI to the core, as our board chair has said, and that we are not scrubbing anything from our website or changing the way that we approach our work. So this means everything, I think, to our staff, because it sets the direction and makes us feel that we can continue with the work that we have been doing and using the same methodology and really talking about this really challenging history. There's a lot at stake for JANM, to take this stance, but I'm just really proud to work there because they have. So we're a national museum, but located on the West Coast, which is really outside of the geographic boundaries of the United States until 1848. We do not talk about colonial history or the Revolutionary period. The story that we tell at JANM begins in the mid-19th century, which signifies the start of the Japanese immigrant diaspora. And yet, while JANM does not cover the history that would seem, to tie to the 250th or the founding of this country, engaging with ideals that this country was founded upon is absolutely integral to our work and such a big part of what we do day in and day out. So while we focus on the entire Japanese American experience from immigration to the present, we talk about the ways in which Japanese Americans have contributed to democracy, despite being considered second-class citizens or even being denied citizenship for decades. And, of course, we also talk about the fragility of democracy through the historical example of the World War II experience of Japanese Americans who were denied due process and the protections of the Constitution when they were forcibly removed from the West Coast and subsequently incarcerated. Conversations about democracy, citizenship, diversity, belonging, and patriotism are just really integral to our educational curriculum, public programming, exhibitions, and our through lines throughout our permanent collection. So in terms of the upcoming commemoration of the semi-quincentennial, at the moment, our galleries are closed as we embark on a renovation. So we'll reopen in the latter part of 2026 with a new core exhibition entitled In the Future We Call Now, Dreams of Democracy, Realities of Racism, that will provide a new perspective on these themes of democracy, belonging, exclusion, and activism. And then we'll also have another exhibition on view entitled Pictures of Belonging, Miki Hayakawa, Hisako Hibi, and Mineo Kubo. And this is an art exhibition that's really trying to change the perception of the American canon of art, to say that, these are American artists that Americans do not know enough about. So here you see JANM's campus, and you see it from the perspective of our Norman Y. Mineta Democracy Plaza. And so as a result of, the galleries being closed now, JANM will commemorate the 250th anniversary through public programming spearheaded by our Democracy Center, which is a program of the Japanese American National Museum. And so we'll participate in some of these larger initiatives that I'm sure many organizations are also participating in. But the collective work of my JANM colleagues really celebrates and grapples with these big ideas that are part of the 250th on a daily basis through our work. So just to tell you a little bit about the Daniel K. Inouye National Center for the Preservation of Democracy, we also for short call it the Democracy Center. So the late Senator Inouye really championed for the Democracy Center at JANM to be a dedicated space to learn and discuss the fragility of democracy and to examine constitutional rights and freedoms that all people in the US should be entitled to. So we mostly do this through public programming, through dialogue, through conversations, lectures. And often it's through the Japanese American experience, but it also looks at ways, we look at ways in which those excluded from full protections of the Constitution have, and their claims to those rights extended the Constitution's promise to all Americans. So I think, that's just sort of, I think, where we are in terms of how we will participate in this commemoration, but really just to say that, even though this is a really big milestone anniversary, we kind of do this on a day in and day out basis, regardless of whether it's a big anniversary or not.
Thank you so much. Ista.
Thank you, Nicole and Kristen. It's great to be on a panel with you both, meet you both, as well as be part of this panel once again. Apologies for my voice. it's been fighting with me the last roughly week. So if I get a little bit more gravelly than I'd prefer, well, there we are. Anyway, where we were, because I was on the panel back in 2023, and in the last 2+ years, the work has been very much sort of on the ground, both at some of my previous sites and then also at my current site. While it's not, directly speaking on the aspects of the 250th, being in Charleston, there's a lot of revolutionary focus, as well as, history is the business here in Charleston in a lot of ways. And what that history looks like very much depends on both the visitors and then also who's speaking on it, in terms of walking tours and historic sites and things like that. It's very much been a sort of fluctuating situation, and as things get much closer to 1770s, or sorry, to the 250th, it's very much a how are things going to look. Charleston always on the 4th has a reading of the Bill of Rights outside of the Old Exchange and Provost Dungeon, which is a very large and well-attended thing. However, even when it comes to the diversity of the speakers, that's always been a point of question. Charleston as a city has gone through a lot of its own changes over time, as well as how it likes to talk about revolutions. It's not just been more recent revolutions. I mean, there were notable revolutions in the Charleston area 30 years before the American Revolution, and that shaped who was considered a person, and then how those non-persons were controlled. And then 30 years later, those self-same controllers are beating the drums and shouting liberty, whilst still making all of their understandings based on the enslavement of people. So it's, it is foundational with a capital F to this country of, in groups and out groups, as well as who's considered people and who's considered not people. And that's always been a very both a massive hypocrisy, and then also, how that, cognitive dissonance is the name of the game, and sadly always has been. And so how that gets to play out over time, we see on an almost daily basis now. And something I always come back to is that history for some is continuation for others. And it's very much something of, if we're talking about this grand experiment of these United States, or the United States as it was known immediately after the Civil War, the American Civil War, how we choose to view what holds up this experiment, what has always held up this experiment. And it's a very interesting way, both in terms of, how things are commemorated, because nations love their founding myths. They love to say specifically, this is what we are, and then also this isn't what we are, as it's convenient for the dominant view of the place. And there are innumerable examples throughout time of all of this. And as much as, folks would like to say, oh, it's just history, it's like, no, it's not, and never really has been for certain groups, because even those aspects of protections within the Constitution are precarious at best, have always frustratingly have been. And so for us, and all of the work that I've done, it's speaking to people from around the state, around the country, and around the world on those nuances, because it's always nuances. Because again, while we love to work in generalities on one hand, we also love our exceptions, right? The presumption is that the exception is the rule, but it's not ever been the rule. It's just we love, we love our hyper individualism. We love our hyper money situations. It's we're the only ones that can do it, right? However, there are things that have allowed this experiment to endure in ways that other experiments have not been allowed to, have been either actively crushed or inactively crushed, or are being crushed as we speak. And so it's interesting to look back at a thing while standing in the thing and looking towards the future. So, yeah.
Thanks for that. And thank you, all of you. So many kind of continuations and resonances across your three statements. Also, I know I wrote down that history for some is continuation for others. And I think I saw Nicole and Kristen doing the same thing. So yeah, just a really kind of important turn of phrase here. So to kind of pick up on something that we've all, but I think maybe especially Nicole was talking about, maybe because you're the first one, there have been numerous conversations in both the public sphere and in the sphere of practice about challenges to commemoration, but really challenges to public history. Whether that's cuts to funding or attacks on history that interrogates where the promises of the revolution have fallen short, or attacks on institutions and practitioners themselves in like really real material ways. Obviously we're in an extraordinary moment. And there are continuations of that moment, like all the things that are happening have been building for a while. But the way that it is happening right now seems like it's going faster and more intensely. So, given the role of history in American culture right now, the way that it's a focus, the way it's been politicized, has been for the last few years. Do you see opportunities? So I want to again go back to something Nicole said, this idea of being radical, innovative, and creative, right? Do you see opportunities for doing history, or new ways of thinking about history for practitioners? How's that? Are there anything that you're working on right now? Any models that you've seen out there or seen other folks working on that you're thinking about, that you're sitting with that, could be ways that we could be changing what we're doing? So again, a kind of wider question. We're thinking about commemoration here in very capacious ways. So this is really more of a question, kind of like how should we actually be doing history now? How are we doing history now? What are the ways that we can be radical? So just to mix things up a little bit, I will start with Kristen, probably then move to Ista and then Nicole.
Sure. Well, I'm not sure if I can comment about how we do history differently broadly, but I can kind of provide like a very specific example of a project that we've been working on at JANM. Let's see. So the project is called the Ide project. And so Ide in Japanese, when translated to English, means to like comfort the spirit. And so thinking about commemoration, I think the Ide project has helped us to really rethink monuments or memorials. And it's also really helped us to think differently about, memory and legacy and memorialization and repair too. So, for so long we've said that 120,000 Japanese Americans were impacted by the mass removal and subsequent incarceration during World War II. But actually no one has ever counted or even created a list of names until very recently. So there's a professor of religion and Japanese studies at USC, Duncan Williams, who took this on as a project within the last few years. And so scoured historical documents to come up with a list of names. And he created this book of the names, which you see here. This is called the Ide Cho. So the Ide project has three different components. The Ide Cho, which is this book of names. This book is a monument. And then the other component is the Ide Zo, which is an online archive with information about the incarcerees. And then the Ide Hi will be a sculptural monument at some point. So the Mellon Foundation has funded this in their approach to like rethinking monuments. And so through this Ide Cho project, he has created this book, and the idea was that the public could come to JANM. It was at JANM for 2 years. Now it's on a national tour, but it was at the museum for 2 years, and members of the public could come and they could honor someone who was incarcerated by stamping their name. And what's I think so powerful about this project is that we think of monuments and memorials as being very static and stationary, but with this monument, it's dynamic and it gains its power as more people interact with it and add stamps to this book. And so it's been, I think, transformational for our institution. I meant to look up some stats, but we have stats about how many names, how many of the 126,000 names have been stamped, and how many people have come to the museum. But it's been incredible to see people coming to the museum almost as this form of pilgrimage, and just how moving it is for them to honor a loved one, a friend, or even someone that they didn't know. And so we see families with multiple generations coming together. We see, so that's what you see on the left, and on the right, this is a survivor of the incarceration experience. She was 99 years old at this moment when she stamped her name in the book. But it's been tremendously impactful for me as a staff member to see people engaging with the book, with the Ide Cho. But I think that it's also really changed the way that people sort of think about history too. And it's become the impetus for families to do further research about their own family history. I think some lesser known facts about their family history has come up as they have learned more about maybe related family members who were also incarcerated. It's inspired multiple generations again to come to the museum, not only engage with the Ide Cho, but also to look at our exhibitions and take a deeper dive into the content we tell at the museum. And again, it's almost been like this pilgrimage, and families have had the reunions at the museum, and I think that it's brought them closer to learning more about where they come from. And so this project, as I mentioned, is now traveling across the country to places where there are large concentrations of Japanese Americans, but also just in places outside of Los Angeles, so where the public can come and anyone can come and stamp a name. And so yeah, and then in the next few years, we should also have a monument at JANM that somehow incorporates the names. So anyway, this is sort of just a project that we've been doing at the museum that I think has had tremendous resonance, and is like a different way, I think, to think about commemoration and maybe how people engage with history.
Thank you for that. Those are amazing photographs too. I just kind of want to point that out, like the families doing it all together. That's really, yeah, really, really wonderful project. Ista, you're next.
In terms of, taking history and making it now is just tying it to the now. It's everything from engaging with young people and all of the questions that they have, as well as for, more marginalized folks, members of the global majority, things like that, when they have questions, and even African descendant people within this country, when they do visit the sites that I've worked and currently work, is remind them that the things they're dealing with now didn't start with them.
Mm.
It didn't start with their parents. It didn't start with their grandparents. It's been centuries upon centuries upon centuries of a very specific way of talking about the history of the place in which they exist, as well as their current lived environment. It didn't start yesterday. It has been a systematized way of control and all of the control and all those things, because again, when a quote from some years ago that I'm going to terribly paraphrase, is the world in which we exist now does not line up with the history that we were taught. It's everything and even in our current moment, just the way that things have been taken down and reframed to obfuscate very real things, to obfuscate it's taking the past and cutting it and shaping it so that in the future there will be less of an understanding, a true understanding of the place in which we exist. And there are many, many, many huge amounts of money and resources and all of those things working towards that goal. Because if you control someone's access to knowledge, you can control almost anything else. And so for myself and for the work that I do at the places that I've worked, it's very much reminding young people and even their parents to look critically at the things that they took for gospel, that they took for, oh, this is clearly how it is. It's like, well, how? Like how did we get the place that we're in now? It certainly didn't come from all the stuff you may have been taught as a child, or as your grandparents were taught, and all of that, and much of it is the joy of watching those light bulb moments. Because for young people, they get it. They absolutely get it. They get it in ways that maybe their parents or grandparents either weren't allowed to get it or had to be much more nuanced in their understandings. And so, but that also comes with a not insignificant amount of pushback, because if you've been told your whole life everything is one way, and then to hear, wait, no, that's not, there is absolutely a significant amount of frustration when it comes to that, anger when it comes to that, destructive force when it comes to that. However, endurance is the goal, community is the goal, understanding is the goal, because there's a difference between knowing a thing and understanding a thing. And my hope with the work and my hope going forward is that there will be more understanding. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
And
Nicole?
for me, I would say we need to play chess, not checkers. This is a long game, and we need to focus on that long game. The attacks that are happening today did not come up overnight, as Ista was saying. These are things that have been in the work for years, a couple of generations. And so this means that we have to get creative in how we talk about history, how we're engaging our public with history, and where we do that history. So for complete disclosure, I am a civic season advisor with Made by Us. And I look at how that team over the past few years have really focused on civic season and civics, but also how they're talking about history. One of the first things that we did to kind of kick off Made by Us was asking people, particularly Gen Z, what they thought about independence. And the answers varied. And it wasn't, oh, let's talk about the Declaration of Independence or let's talk about the 4th of July. It was, what does this mean to you? we're getting them into this conversation in a way that is not textbook, that is not academic, that is not heavy. And so we think about how we tell the stories, how we're elevating the stories, using popular culture to make those connections. I am a popular culture nerd. If you are ever in a conversation with me about deep history things, you might get a different world reference, you might get a good place reference, you might get a sports reference, and people are like, make it make sense. And it always does, because that's where they can make a connection. And so when we think about that, that's a way to get people to have these full-blown history lessons. It's how we speak. It's how I know that there's a lot about the proper diction and the proper ways. But listen, find your vernacular and get into it because you're going to meet your audience where they're at, and then you can bring them along with you. I am always for just kind of understanding how can I finesse this approach? How do we get really excited about this work and make other people excited about it? And as a practitioner, that's one of the things that I'm always encouraging my fellow practitioners for. Like, we're public historians for a reason. And I love, first of all, my academics, I love y'all. I love y'all to my core because without the tireless work that you do, I don't really have much, right? However, y'all know y'all talk for each other, and y'all know y'all talk in a language that the general public does not understand. But that's where we can come into play and really elevate and activate that work that's being done. This gets this gets the kids excited. It gets the adults who are like, wait a minute, I learned this differently to say, oh, wait, but you mean 50 years later, y'all actually discovered something else? Yes, we did. And let me show you how this connects. That's what we're doing. And we have to do this 10 toes down. We have to be committed to this work. We have to be committed to um, thinking outside of the box when we were talking about our history, particularly American history in this moment. We are looking at funding cuts, erasures, closures, general obstacles. We got to think differently. We have to move differently. And sometimes it takes taking a page out of the other side, right? Take a page out that book. Yo, this is a long game. How do I want to stretch this out? What do I want you to know today, tomorrow, next year, 5 years, 10 years? How do I get you on the bandwagon to understanding that our history isn't necessarily changing? How we tell our narratives has evolved. And it's evolved because of ongoing scholarship. It's evolved because we are adding new voices. It's evolved because we're able to see those names of men, women, and children who are incarcerated, right? Because first of all, I saw the book and when Kristen was showing the pictures, like I saw that I was there in those moments, giving people access to actually seeing the thing, it changes everything. We've got to be willing to not make our artifacts so precious that they seem to be in a glass box and nobody can access it. We've got to create new artifacts by allowing the public to engage with the history and add their story and add their voice. We got to switch things up. People are out here saying all types of things. So maybe your program is two truths and a history misinformation instead of two truths and a lie, because people get mad when you flat out call them liars. But if you gently say, hey, I understand that you might have learned that, but let me actually school you on this. Like, we've really got to change how we're doing this work, because if we don't, we're going to be the ones who are left behind. And as practitioners, we have to be thinking of what our next move is while we are in the current moment. We need to think about what 5 years looks like. We need to think about 275. What is that even going to mean? Will we be here? Will we be talking about, yo, at 250, we all fell apart? Like, these are the things that we have to really start doing. Because if we really just stick in the then and the here and now, it is depressing. I'm not going to sit here and act like it is not. However, if we don't have hope, how do we give the public some hope? And if we're not thinking differently about this, how can we get them to come along that ride with us? So play the long game, y'all. We got this.
Thanks so much. I'm eventually writing this up for the public historian, and you guys are making my job so easy for me. So thank you for that. So the main reason why I'm here, a non-practitioner, why I'm the moderator and why I've been the series editor is because I study commemoration. So the way that I've been thinking about this is very much kind of like, what are the legacies of the 200th? I wrote a book about the bicentennial. What is that going to look like for the 250th? So the framing that kind of I keep on coming back to is that commemoration, because of the sort of focused attention that it brings, and I mean extra funding for projects, but people just like thinking about history and having to think about projects for history, and space to reflect, is that they tend to act as accelerants for things that are already in play, right? So in the case of the bicentennial, a lot of people were interested in history from the bottom up. People were already doing this stuff, but the bicentennial kind of comes along. And concentrates them. So, and I think this is, I think this is still, I think as a framing, this still holds, right? And I kind of hear you already saying this in various ways. But what I'd like to ask is, what are the kind of large scale forces? What are the things that are already in the water that are informing the conversations that we're having for the 250th? And what kind of legacies are those going to be, right? For how we think about history, how we do public history, how we do commemoration. So I kind of want to tag three things that I've heard across sort of multiple, especially in the way that you were addressing the three of you, the last question. The sort of young people. Also kind of different. So, we've been thinking a lot about federal funding, but in the case of Mellon, which is funding the project that Kristen was talking about, the Made by Us and Civic season, like who are going to be the new actors? And then finally, yeah, it's both Ista and Nicole were talking about different ways of talking about history practice. So those are just three that I've kind of been thinking about, or that I've heard you talk about here. But I'm curious, and this is, by the way, the last question before we sort of try to reflect all together and then invite everyone else to reflect. What are the legacies going to be, or what is, if we're thinking about the 250th as an accelerant and concentrator, a sort of petri dish, what are the things that are already happening in the world of how we think about public history and how we need to be thinking about public history for the future that are likely to be concentrated, or should be concentrated, and that are going to fundamentally change our practice? And I think, let's see, we'll do Ista, and then Nicole, and then Kristen.
I think in hearing and understanding Nicole, it's very much a situation where we're definitely going to have to both play the long game when it comes to our ideas of what, because we all have something of a general idea as to what will be what may be very specifically commemorated in this particular 250th. However, the need to look beyond that to 275, depending on where things are at, and even in the period in between, it's important to remind folks of that groundwork and keep sort of working forward to that, engaging young people, engaging different funding sources, because what were previously seen as, oh yeah, we have all, we're going to have all this money, that's not the case anymore. And there are absolutely funding sources out there, whether they'll be on a grassroots kind of side or not, but realizing that we are within an era of paradigm shift. And so when it comes to what was previously the case for many, many, many people, many organizations, things like that, realizing that we will, we got this and we will endure is very much a thing. And so it's almost viewing the 250th as, okay, this is one point, but we have to be thinking further beyond that. Because commemoration is more often moments in time as much as and again, we don't know with a lot of certainty what the legacy of that is, what the legacy of it is going to be. I mean, there were, just looking at the previous commemorations in some ways, and what gets talked about, what doesn't get talked about, and realizing that for many, many people, commemoration is okay. There's going to be fireworks, there's going to be parades, there's going to be these things, and then what? And then what? Will things shift in a way that speaks more to liberty, that speaks more to the fundamentals of democracy? And whether or not we hear that on a national level, we're still going to be pushing for those things on a grassroots and in between level. Engaging with young people, engaging with funding, and all of those things, because even if it's not talked about in an open way, there's still that hope in the democratic ideas. There's still that hope in what independence is, what freedom is, what personhood is. And that's very much something that, will be worked towards. Yeah, will be worked towards. So.
Thanks so much. Nicole, you're next.
I think so. When we're thinking about the conversations around the 250th right now, the largest scale force that we have has been politics, uppercase and lowercase. It has changed the hopes and dreams that we had to what are we going to be able to do? And I think that is going to be the lasting legacy of what is our pivot? How do we make a way out of chaos? How do we think about engaging numerous audiences who very much see this history very differently, and how that has shifted some organizations, not by choice, but by force, how that has shifted how some communities had planned their commemorations because now they need to think about safety, how that looks at what we are doing in this moment and how we're rising to this occasion. Like our legacy as practitioners, as public historians, as academics is going to be tied to how we react. And I think we have to be cognizant that, what are the things that people don't like to talk about at a dinner table? Religion, politics, and money. We're going to have to start talking about these topics. And we have to acknowledge that they do have an impact and it does matter. And so I think when we are thinking about the lasting legacy of this particular commemoration, how did we stand to this? There are conversations that we wanted to have that we may not be able to have in the same way that we dreamed of, but does that stop us? There are events that we wanted to do, but due to lack of funding, do we adapt a pandemic mind frame where we're like, okay, the power of the pivot, and if are things done virtually, are things done through newsletter, are things done through different mediums? We have to think about, and again, going back to Kristen, just because y'all have been like mad 10 toes down, and I love it. I love to see it. Are we willing to take the risks? And do we take those risks? Understanding that, either we could lose it all or we could actually win big in the long run. Those are our legacies. Those are the things that we need to think about when we are considering this particular commemoration. When we look back, even 10 years from now, let's give a 260 update, right? Where are we as institutions? Where are we as a field? Where are we when we look back and say, that was rough, but we got through it? What are we willing to do? How do we want to interrogate those foundational documents and what it means to us in this moment, but also renew that hope that we had for this moment to the next one and say, okay, but how can we live these ideals? How do we make sure that there's not a question of personhood or citizenship or belonging? How do we ensure that, granted, when this was first written, it wasn't really for us, but we're going to make it for us. We are going to ensure that all voices are included, that we have this shared set of values, which I know can get real dicey sometimes. But if our value is liberty, if our value is equality, if our value is freedom, that we all have those, knowing that it's going to look a little different depending on who you're talking to, but we still share that. We still hold those very close to us. Our legacy is going to be how we act in that. And I think this is the moment, understanding that you got to play politics, upper and lower, but how you play the game determines really what's next for this country. Are we willing to play it, and are we willing to take those risks?
Thank you for that. Kristen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded about, what Nicole has been saying, like this is a long game, and I think that in circles like this, we can really talk about just the reality of the situation and how challenging it is for us as historians, as public historians. But I think to the public, like our work is more relevant and important now than maybe ever before, right? And so while I'm a realist and probably feeling really pessimistic, I'm trying to also have some optimism as well. And I think some encouraging things is that, again, our leadership taking this stance, and they have said that we will lose some people, but hopefully we will gain some people and then sustain people who really believe in what we stand for. And we've seen that. So when we received the NEH termination letter or workshops to bring teachers to the museum, our stakeholders, our members, and donors really stepped up and helped to fund that. So that was very encouraging. We've definitely been impacted by all of this, and so don't get me wrong, but I was really encouraged by a colleague yesterday who was presenting on the AAM survey that has been they're collecting data and specifically about some of JANM stakeholders, and just the reminder that the public really trusts museums and libraries, and that number or that percentage of people who say that they trust museums, libraries, and their friends and family, but museums has really gone up in that. And so it shows that people really value museums. They trust museums and libraries and historical societies to really provide credible sources to tell more inclusive histories. And so I think that's something to really to remember. They believe that museums use evidence to tell important history. They value museums preserving history, artifacts, stories. So that's all really good. So I just want to sort of remember that. But in terms of what does this commemoration sort of mean? What should it be? I mean, it should be somewhat celebratory to mark this major milestone and the ideals that this country has been founded on. However, the historical narratives that accompany this commemoration cannot be oversimplified or unbalanced or even too celebratory, right? That instead we have to really tell a more inclusive narrative that is just as frank about the challenges and contestations, the complexities, and setbacks, as well as the promises and successes. So I think that's really important, and that the 250th should really be this call to action to renew our commitment to strengthen democracy, to tell more comprehensive narratives that include historically underrepresented groups, and really to inspire people to become more civically minded, engaged, and of course more broadly informed. Preaching to the choir here, but I think we all really believe in this, but this seems like this pivotal moment to remind us that this is so important. And I think as public historians, we want to continue to engage the public and use the lessons of history to really to make sense of the present and, of course, inform the future. So we want people to know that over time, Americans have really put forth incredible effort and experienced great triumphs and challenging power. I think that's what's so important. And this is in the spirit of the American Revolution. And, all these examples over time should really be commemorated and celebrated. So I'm just sort of parroting a lot of things that I've heard recently or like work that my colleagues have been done this whole time, but I just wanted to also plug something that I heard recently. So Secretary Bunch from the Smithsonian was at JANM maybe a month ago or so, a couple months ago. He was an inaugural speaker for a distinguished lecture series named after JANM's founding director, Irene Hirano. And his remarks were just incredibly inspirational. I'll put a link to the recording of his talk below, but I just kind of wanted to just share some of the things that he said during his remarks. He was talking sort of about Irene Hirano, JANM's founding director, who, together they started a number of museums. And so he was saying that Irene really believed in that what is essential is recognizing that you cannot run from history. You cannot erase history because it has profoundly shaped who we are. The great strength of a nation is looking at its past, learning from the past, and using the past to point us towards a different future. Finding a usable and useful history is really important. There was a time when all we wanted to do was make sure that stories have been left out, were added back in. And he said that's important, but the other part of it is seeing that those stories not just have been added back in to the narrative, but have profoundly shaped us all, not just a particular community. So he said it's important for us to embrace our history, revel in that history, but recognize that this history is bigger than one community and shaped us all. And so I think really this is our charge as public historians, right? Is to, tell these stories, but not just to say like this happened to this one particular group of people or to this one person, but to say like this happened and frankly, it has shaped us all as a result of it. And so that's going to be our charge. And I just wanted to end with this image. So this is an artifact that we're preparing for our new core exhibition. And I bring this up because we were working on this flag the day that I received a termination notice from IMLS for our Museums of America grant. And so this is a flag that is 70 feet by 40 feet. It's massive. It takes up our entire hall, as you see here. And so we were vacuuming it. This is a flag that was made by the Women's Auxiliary of the Monterey Japanese American Citizens League in 1938. So during the middle of the Depression, these American-born Japanese women and their immigrant mothers made this flag so that they could parade it in the 4th of July parade in Monterey, California in 1938. And 4 years later, they were removed from their homes and communities and they were incarcerated. And I just think that it's so poignant because it shows that they profoundly believed in the ideals that this country was founded on and decided to make this bold statement by making this flag. And I think that it's something that even if you're not of Japanese descent, you really can resonate with. All Americans can resonate with this story. And so I just, I'm thinking about Secretary Bunch's words about how we need to just take these stories and really make sure that all Americans can really resonate and feel that, it is part of their story. And again, it's a tall order, but as Nicole says, this is a long game. And I'm really inspired that, by the good work that is being done throughout this field and led together, I do think that we can make a big impact. So.
Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, we're all looking for inspiration now, and that's such a powerful story. And Secretary Bunch's words too. I mean, like I think we're all looking for people to talk to and for community, and to hear what people are doing, and how they're coping. And this is in so many ways has been really inspirational, really helpful. So we have about 25 minutes left in the program. And this is where so I only prepared 3 questions, but they're really meaty ones. Now we are going to turn it over into the improv portion of, for me, it's actually the evening because I'm in Luxembourg, but for everyone else, the improv portion of the lunch hour. So what I want for audience members to do is to start putting your questions into the Q&A. So very importantly, don't put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A. When they go into the Q&A box, that means that all the panelists can see them, and can address them and mark that they are addressed. So please start doing that. And while you do that, I would like to give the panelists one more kind of opportunity. Are there things that are, to kind of start to get us warmed up for opening up into a more freewheeling conversation? Any last thoughts? Are there things that are still on your mind? Is there anything you want to revisit that, or, that you found resonant, or wanted to call attention to or respond to that any of the other panelists said? Any kind of burning thoughts, hot takes, really inspirational things that you have heard, wonderful popular culture references that might help us work through this moment. This is the time. So yeah, just as the audience members are hopefully putting lots and lots of questions into the Q&A box there. I'd like to just open it up to the panelists, and I won't call on anyone. So hopefully whoever feels moved to speak, please do. I'm hoping someone feels moved to speak.
Well, I was
I
thinking a little bit about Kristen's last photo with the flag and part of our conversation from our panel, and really thinking about how so many groups who had been done so wrong by this country have still given their all to this country. We talked about Black World War I and World War II vets that came home to extreme racism, but fought for something that they wouldn't be able to actually participate in. And I think about the flag. So again, disclosure, I grew up in Hawaii. So the content in Kristen's museum is personal in a different way for me, because that is what I grew up learning in school. And so it is very close to me. And my parents live across the water from Pearl Harbor. Like, we look at the Arizona every morning. That's their view. And I think about how much these groups that have been long discriminated against have taken such pride in America, even when America has not taken pride in them. And when we were talking about citizenship and belonging in our session, it's that thing that keeps resonating with me. For some of us, we want to ask, why would you keep doing that when you know they don't like you? And it's not so much the people that they're focused on, but it's the ideals and the ideals of democracy. And I think that is a guiding light to navigating how it feels some days when you're like, oh, I don't belong here. But it's like, no, you do. You absolutely do. You do because of these ideals. And I think about how, as we're thinking about just personally 250, what does that mean for us as individuals and how we carry out our work as public historians? And where do we belong in this very long narrative? And so that flag kind of struck me a little bit because I was just like, you give and you give and you give. And you got to wonder, like, is this worth it? And I think about those that came before us, they absolutely thought that it was. How dare we let that legacy and their enduring legacy down? And so for me, it makes me want to fight harder, knowing that there were folks that came before us that absolutely knew that they would never be embraced and accepted, but they continued to fight anyway because they believed in those ideals.
Well, so I mean, what you're saying, Nicole, is so important. You grew up in Hawaii. This was the history that you learned growing up there, and so you resonate with it because it is what you were introduced to early on. And I think that's what's so key, right? Is that if we can create that same experience and for all Americans to say like this is just the history of the United States and it's more inclusive and people can resonate and feel like it is part of their own story, then that's what's going to create the empathy. That's what's going to help fulfill, the promises of this country. I guess those are lofty goals, but just the fact that, because most people, when they're not exposed to this kind of history, that they just yeah, but it just shows like what happens when you're introduced to it, and it just becomes part of your story very early on, and just the power of that. So I didn't know that you were up in Hawaii, but that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that.
Actually, both of y'all have ties to parts of me. So I was born in Charleston too. My family's from Charleston. So like Charleston, Johns Island, all of that. So I'm like, oh, this is a little homecoming for me. I love it.
Any other thoughts before we open up to questions? Any other good examples that you've seen? If this is, since we are at the moment where the rubber is hitting the road, yeah, like what kind of public history projects? So, Kristen, you've been talking a lot about what you've been doing, what you've been working on. Nicole, you talked a little bit about your work with Civic Season, and with Made by Us. Ista, what are you working on right now?
Within sort of my day to day, a lot of it is, um, you know, we do a lot of work with ancestral cemeteries
Mhm.
and as well as descendant communities. So we're doing what we can to marry sort of the past to the present. And then with more sort of the other side of what I do, I have I do consulting work and things like that, and so a lot of that is just reminding different groups of people as well as even people locally, there are other ways of engaging with this history that aren't just sitting in a book or sitting in a an article that you've got to pay too much money for, or just reminding people that community exists kind of all around you, even if it doesn't necessarily look the way that you think it does. And there's been a lot of demographic changes in Charleston over the last decade and even in the last 5 years. So it's been really interesting to engage with a lot of the Kumyas um, about the history of the place that they now live. And while they may think, oh, I live in a really nice house or I live in a really nice tract of land, well, you exist on stolen land and you probably exist on a plantation. And so, how that shapes their understanding of the place that they're in, and how that can be both a good thing and then also a push towards wanting to preserve it, wanting to understand it in a more meaningful way, rather than just like, okay, this is my cookie cutter house next to my friend's cookie cutter house, and on and on and on. And then sort of going back to both what Kristen has been saying and what Nicole has been saying, I wrote down, sort of in the aspects of, the belief of the country, belief in the ideals, even if they don't believe in you, and just the importance of that as a reminder, because it helps people have hope, right? And that's the strongest thing we got. Hope and love, right there with it, can endure innumerable things. And the challenge is the challenge, but the challenge isn't new. It just wears a different colored hat. So, yeah.
Something I've been, oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I was just I cut you off. I apologize.
Oh no, no, it's fine. It's yeah, yeah. So that was kind of it. Uh,
Oh, well, I was just gonna say that something that I really liked that you said earlier was the way that young people like get it, that when you're having conversations with young people, they're the ones who are like, yeah, yeah, this is
yeah,
exactly right. Hearing
yeah,
about that
yeah,
is one of the things that really inspires me. Nicole, you
yeah.
said in the chat that you had one more project.
I did, and I know y'all are sick of me talking, but I'm gonna do it one more time. And just one of the things that we're doing, because I know in this framing, I am largely just kind of a public historian that's doing the work of enslavement. But one thing that I did want to plug that we are doing at the center that looks at kind of commemoration in a different way, and really those community voices with our Truth and Transformation project. This program is looking at two main things right now, but they just kind of wrapped, and I think there's still some more work to do on commemorating the 1906 Atlanta Race Massacre and really bringing that to the forefront of people's minds here in Atlanta. Many people didn't know that that was happening. They worked with many community groups, including the Fulton County Remembrance Coalition, to really get that programming going. And then another thing that they're doing with the descendant community is looking at the Chattahoochee bricks and understanding that this was a place of convict leasing and convict labor, and bringing those descendant communities into the conversation as we work to build a memorial on the site where that was done. And it's bringing the communities and those voices into these conversations and not saying, look at the thing that we're doing, but more or less, look at this history that has existed in our backyard. And these people who have direct ties to this history are still here. Let's hear what they have to say, how they remember their loved ones, how those stories had been passed down. And let's use our place as an institution to lift that up, to help those organizations. And it's using our resources to tell bigger stories that don't originate from us, but we have a platform to do that. They just came back from Sugarland, where they were looking at the site there and kind of understanding that history. They've met with a team going to Germany. And so these conversations around reconciliation and how we really talk about our history, how we commemorate some of these events, that is essential and that is key, especially because we're bringing in the community. It's their story to tell. We just have to give them the space to do it. And I feel like that is, yes, Amy. And I feel like that is really what's key as we think about all of the things that are happening today with history, with public history, and how we're telling the stories. The community is still wanting us to do this work. Like Kristen said, we are some of the most trusted sources in our communities. Let's take this opportunity to actually meet them where they are and say, how can we help you? How can we be a voice for you? We don't want to take it over, but how can we be a voice for you to help others learn about this history? So I would be remiss if I did not mention that work.
Thank you for that. I love that. So speaking actually of community history, we have one question in the chat from History Cambridge. So I am going to read it out loud. So our city, like many others, has leaned into the theme of revolutionary as being a concept that goes well beyond its traditional 18th century time period. So this is true of everybody on this panel too. But how can we best expand the scope of the revolution to include a wider demographic group while not becoming so broad that we lose our rootedness in the Revolutionary War era? So yeah, this is a question that I think is both specific to the city of Cambridge, but also, yeah, might be. So I think, yeah, so if anyone has any thoughts on that or would like to kind of start addressing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of sort of addressing this throughout all of our remarks, but I think, how we're trying to take some of these, ideals that were so important to this revolutionary period in U.S. history, and how over time, like it's sort of been put into practice in other ways. And so at JANM, again, we do talk about like the fragility of democracy, how democracy has failed, how the Constitution has failed, and then on the flip side of that, how Japanese Americans have used the democratic system to take cases to the U.S. Supreme Court, to challenge the mass removal and incarceration. And so I think in that ways, we're taking the spirit of these ideals that this country was founded on, and just using over time like how others have continued that spirit and continue to further these ideals. So that's just so baked into like the school tours that we have, the public programs, and again the collection that we have. So yeah, that's just what we do at JANM. And I'm hoping that if we keep just kind of focusing on these ideals of freedom, democracy, patriotism, all this, that even though we are an ethnic specific museum, we are trying to tell this broader story about the US. And I'm just hoping that people won't see us just as this woke DEI institution, and seeing more that it's just another example of how this country has really tried to live up to the promise of its founding.
So we still have time for one or two more questions from the audience. So this would be, this would be your time if you have questions you want to follow up on anything that any of our panelists have said. If you would love insight on something that you're working on, this is the time to get it in there. But in the meantime, I will ask another question. And I kind of want to, I think I want to follow up on sort of, yeah, the question of the youngest people, right? So, those kids in the pictures that Kristen shared, the kids that Ice was talking about, the Generation Z people in Made by Us. Like I keep on kind of coming back to the potential of that generation as being the sort of, the new interlocutors for public historians. So I just was curious if what thoughts you might have about how to talk to those people, what those people are interested in. Sounds like maybe I saw you're already kind of doing well connecting with them. So yeah, please tell us more about yeah what we're seeing in the youngest, our future, right? Those people who are going to be there for the 300th.
So some of the young folks that we engage with because of the sites where I'm at will have tangible things like fingerprints in bricks. And I can speak to the general ages of the people that made those bricks and how those bricks were made and the process and all of that. And so it's very interesting to have young people come up and, and say, oh, my fingers fit or they don't. And that both affects, their parents and then also themselves. But more to the point of remembrance and all of those things is that as in a much more general sense with things like the internet in all of its nuances and difficulties, it connects people. It connects people in ways that did not previously exist in the way that we understand it. And not so much to use internet slang and colloquialisms because I'm bad at that. I'm what the kids call an old. I have dreadlocks older than many of the people that I interact with sometimes, but more to the point, it's just meeting them where they are because their parents are their parents and their parents came through a very possibly a very specific way of understanding their lives, and maybe they don't want to necessarily or they haven't had the time or the energy or what have you to engage with the nuance. But when I have families come up and feel the fingerprints in bricks, it hits them in very tangible ways because it's a reminder that, oh no, this isn't just whitewashed. It's hard to whitewash these things. And one of my sort of big passion projects, just personally, is going to places, like Atlanta, like Boston, like New York, like Philadelphia, like Savannah or Charleston, and looking for fingerprints. It's just a thing that my brain does, which can be frustrating to anybody who's visiting with me, or showing me around because I'm like, oh, hold on a second, or because we'll be in a restaurant and I'll see fingerprints, and so what it is it's this reminder that the past is not the past. It's not just this thing that you put in a box in a case and that's it. That's the past. It's forever a living, breathing, changing thing. And I think for young people, they get that. They fundamentally understand in ways that some of us may not in the current day, like the stuff that's absolutely messed up about the country, right? And how and why and they have the energy and they have the drive, but more than anything, they have the hope that things can change. And the best thing that I can do is foster that. Is answer every single question that a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old has, because they may have that question, but the rest of the group may need to know the answer. And so engaging with them in that way is valuable for everybody involved. And it also reminds me and keeps me somewhat, flexible in terms of the way I, phrasing and colloquialisms and things like that. Because, I won't say that I'm hip with the kids by any means, but just being able to frame things in ways that they can understand and then they can take with them. Because it's not, if all I get is a group of people for an hour and a half and I never see them again, I'm going to give them as much as I possibly can. I'm going to plant as many seeds as I can. As many seeds as I can so that when they go off into the rest of their lives, they can grow stuff if they want to. Stuff will grow anyway, but to be able to say, okay, I had this one experience and it affected the rest of my life. And so that's my hope and my goal with all of it. So yeah.
Thank you for that. We have time for maybe one more. Nicole or Kristen, you have any thoughts or anything you want to share about young people?
I mean, I think we're trying to figure this out at Janum, but I will say that I am impressed, just from the observations of like who was coming to interact with the 8HO, just to see, this younger generation still so engaged with legacy and their family's story, and just to think that they still seem to resonate with the World War II experience, even though now it's becoming like it's their grandparents or great grandparents who were incarcerated. And if it's their grandparents, they were really young, in camp, but they still have this resonance to this history. And they feel this like commitment or responsibility, I think, to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So I think that's impressive to see. And, my experience is more just with the interns that like I work with, and just their passion for, working at the museum and being part of this, this work to preserve, this history has been really inspiring to me. But we do hope that, we can, help to transform like the visitors that come in through our door, whether it's, kids coming for a school visit or, young people who's, resonates with the story we tell as part of their family history, that somehow they'll be inspired and that they'll, really try to become, activists in their own lives. So I do see that, and it is encouraging. We just want to do that on a broader scale, I think. Yeah.
The babies get it. They don't need to be shielded from it. They get offended when we do. I think if we talk to them like we talk to each other, we would get a lot further because they get it.
Well, I think that's a great sentiment to, leave this conversation on. I saw there's a couple more questions that came in super, super late, so I'm really sorry that weren't able to get to them. But thank you to all of our panelists and to NCPH and to NPS, and especially to you, our lunchtime audience. This has been, this is a challenging moment, but this has been a really inspirational conversation. What I hope is that everyone has kind of come away with some new frames to think about, and to kind of inspire us as we move from thinking about the impending conversation. Sorry, the impending commemoration. That was meant to be impactful, and I stuttered. The impending commemoration. Again, this has been a 5-year conversation. We're here in 2025, so let's make something happen for 2026. Thank you very much again, and yeah, please keep an eye out for the article. Please go back and read the other articles. Please, continue coming to NCPH events. And thank you all very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.